St. Petersburg, 1912. Tsar Nicholas Romanov, his wife Alexandra, and their son and heir Alexei in all their glory. Their 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for 300 years. In another 6, it would all be over. Nicholas was the wrong man in the wrong place, a mild, awkward man whose country would be ravaged by war and revolution. His wife was detested by her subjects, thought to be a spy and a fool under the spell of a depraved madman. The Romanovs seemed oblivious to it all. Echoes of passion and tragedy still haunt their photographs, letters, and diaries.
Petitions and audiences without end. Saw Alex for 1 hour only. It is sad that my work takes so many hours which I would prefer to spend exclusively with Alex. I am so indescribably happy with her.
Never did I believe there could be such utter happiness in this world, such a feeling of unity between 2 mortal beings.
But love did not conquer all. It blinded them to the fury that raged just outside their grand and glorious palaces. In the end, revolution would sweep Nicky, his wife Alex, and their 5 children away, and murder them in a Siberian cellar. Nicholas's first encounter with assassination came when he was only 12. In March 1881, his grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, was returning to the Winter Palace when something was hurled at his carriage. A bomb shaped like an Easter cake left him disemboweled and dismembered, but alive. He was rushed home, where the imperial family gathered in haste. Nicky's cousin, the Grand Duke Alexander, wrote about the tragedy some time later.
He was a terrifying sight. His right leg torn off, his left leg shattered, innumerable wounds all over his head and face. One eye was shut, the other expressionless. I clung to the arm of Nicky, deathly pale in his blue sailor's suit.
My father led me up to the bed. "Papa," he said, "your sunshine is here." I saw the flicker of an eyelid. Grandfather's blue eyes opened and he tried to smile. He knew me.
The trauma of assassination was to haunt Nicky all his life. His father, now Alexander III, inherited the Russian Empire, and Nicholas became Tsarevich, the heir apparent. He would be taught the foundation stones of the Romanov faith: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. More simply, the Church, the Tsar, and Russia. Ordinary Russians, the vast majority of the population, saw the Tsar, including Nicholas later in his life, as only one step away from God himself.
At home, we had icons and a portrait of the Tsar. The Tsar was like God on earth, And icons, God in heaven. We prayed to the Tsar and to God. Our whole family did that.
Nicholas believed so firmly in the Romanov edifice of autocracy that he would fail to see that its foundation stones were crumbling. A retinue of literally thousands cocooned the Romanov family, keeping them in a very real and necessary sense prisoners in their palaces. The Romanovs were an illustrious line which had ruled Russia since 1613. Peter the Great had founded the magnificent city of St. Petersburg in 1703 to be a window on the West. Another Romanov, Catherine the Great, had taken the dynasty to new heights of glory which rivaled those of any European clan. The Romanovs were the most extravagant rulers in the Western world, though they paid for the upkeep of their palaces and staff out of their own pocket. But that pocket was wide and deep. The Romanov Empire comprised 1/6 of the globe. The Russia over which the Romanovs ruled seemed to have changed little over the centuries. But the old world and the new were beginning to pull apart. Russia was a nation of extremes, vastly diverse in race, religion, and wealth. From the bottom of the social pyramid, the poor looked up at the rich, who made no excuses for their privileges. As a child, Margot Tracy was one who lived this life of opulence and ease.
When there were big dinner parties, we could have 600 people to dinner because the winter garden was enormous and it gave onto the dining room. And of course there were palm trees there and all kinds. It was only here that somebody said to me, well, what happened when those palm trees grew to the ceilings? And my sister said, well, didn't you know they used to lift the roof up? They never cut the palm trees, they just let them go on.
I worked doing embroidery in the houses of the nobility, of army generals, of wealthy people. They took pity on me, especially the cooks. I was so little, I was only 7. I went there to embroider monograms on their fine linens. I sewed for 14 hours a day, and that's why I'm so hard-working even now. I can sew for 14 hours at a stretch.
Such unquestioning industry, even from children, underpinned the aristocrats' certainty that their world would never change. At the apex of it all, Nicholas Romanov grew up in luxury and unlimited privilege. His life was almost that of a playboy. During the social season, from New Year to Lent, he attended as many as 20 glamorous events a month. Concerts of new music by Mussorgsky or the ballets of Tchaikovsky. After the show, he and his young officer retinue might invite some of the actresses or ballerinas to supper. In this way, he met in the spring of 1890 Matilda Kaczynskaya. She was 17 and Nicholas 21. An affair blossomed, but was interrupted that fall when Nicholas's father sent him off on a 9-month world tour. The future Tsar visited Europe, Africa, and Asia, ending his trip in Japan. His close friend, the Prince of Greece, went with him and was called on to defend the unlucky Tsar.
My grandmother's brother, Prince George of Greece, accompanied Nicholas, and they were riding together in a sort of a rickshaw arrangement when suddenly a crazed Japanese attacked Nicholas and hit him over the head with a saber. And Uncle George told me about this years later. I took my walking stick and exceedingly demolished this Japanese.
But in his diary, Nicholas was gracious and forgiving to his Asian hosts.
I do not blame the kind Japanese people. How can I, with so many condolences, so many gifts?
In July 1891, while returning home from Japan, Nicholas visited the Siberian town of Tobolsk. He admired the bell of the Kremlin's cathedral and was entertained at the governor's house. 26 years later, Nicholas would spend many months in the same house, deposed and a prisoner. For generations, men like the governor of Tobolsk had oiled the wheels of the Tsarist system. In turn, the Tsars had always supported Russia's elite. But as the end of the 19th century neared, frustration and resentment at the Iron Rule were brewing in some of the younger members of the population. One of these disaffected young men was named Alexander Ulyanov. He was condemned to Schlüsselburg prison outside St. Petersburg for his attempted assassination of Tsar Alexander, Nicholas's father. In 1887, Ulyanov was hanged. He had grown up 2,000 miles away from the capital, in the town of Simbirsk. The high school he attended was fertile ground for budding young revolutionaries. The headmaster's son was Alexander Kerensky, who would play a key role in the still distant revolution. Ultimately, neither Alexander Kerensky nor Alexander Ulyanov were the most famous of Simbirsk High School's revolutionaries. Ulyanov had a younger brother who had impressed the headmaster.
Very gifted, always neat and assiduous, Ulyanov received the gold medal as the most deserving pupil. Religion and discipline were the basis of his upbringing.
He was taking his final exams just as his big brother was being hanged from the gallows. This young man would become known to Russia and the world as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. In 1891, the collision of Nicholas and Lenin was still years away. The Romanov dynasty was firmly entrenched, and in their 900-room Gatchina palace, the 21-year-old future Tsar, Nicholas II, was a young man in love.
My dream one day is to marry Alex H. I have loved her a long while. Am nearly convinced our feelings are mutual.
Alex H. was a shy German princess named Alex Victoria Helena Louise Beatrice von Hesse-Darmstadt, but known to her family as Sunny. In 1884, 12-year-old Alex had met 16-year-old Nicky at the wedding of her sister Ella to Nicky's uncle Sergei. Though it was love at first sight, it was a decade before Nicky got a chance to pop the question. They were in Germany, where much of Europe's closely related royalty, including Alex's grandmother, Queen Victoria, had gathered for yet another wedding.
For 10 years, Nicholas was waiting for the right moment to make his official proposal to Alex. On the 8th of April, he draws 3 thick lines under the date. The dream he had cherished for 10 years had come true.
A marvelous, unforgettable day in my life, the day of my engagement to my precious, beloved Alex. Walked around the entire day in a haze, not fully conscious, actually, of what happened to me.
But they were not together for long. She leaves for England, he returns to Russia. And from then on, letters, letters without end. They wrote to each other every day. Here are Alexandra's letters. They're full of love, full of sweet, affectionate words. They call each other by tender little nicknames.
For my darling Nicky dear, from his deeply loving and devoted old owl.
Again and again, the same old face, Nicky.
Alex was 22 years old when she became engaged to the next Tsar of Russia. Her mother had died when she was only 6, and Alex became a regular visitor to England, where she was taught to be a proper Victorian by her grandmother, Queen Victoria herself. A combination of naivete and a sense of entitlement made Alex believe she could overcome any obstacles. But her primness and lack of humor did not go over well with the sophisticated Russian court.
Alix was not Queen Victoria's granddaughter for nothing. In fact, she was Queen Victoria's favourite granddaughter. And she had the attitudes you would expect. When she became empress, she tried to set up little knitting circles in the Winter Palace. And the Russian great ladies were not very amused by this. Petersburg high society was cultured, very elegant, and pretty loose living. And they regarded this rather shy, prim, almost sort of little daughter of an English rectory as beneath their contempt in many ways.
Later that same year, at the imperial summer palace at Livadia, Tsar Alexander fell unexpectedly ill. In October, at the age of 49, he died. His 26-year-old son, Nicholas, was now Tsar of Russia. Nicholas's younger sister, Grand Duchess Olga, was one of the Romanov family assembled at the deathbed.
Nicky was in despair. He kept saying that he did not know what would become of us all, that he was wholly unfit to reign. And yet, Nicky's unfitness was by no means his fault. He should have been taught statesmanship, and he was not.
Nicky's brother-in-law, the Grand Duke, known as Sandro, also remembered the young Tsar's desperation.
Nicky asked me, "Sandro, what am I going to do? What is going to happen to me, to you, to Alex, to Mother, to Russia? I'm not ready to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one."
The day after Alexander died, the family gathered to mourn in a small private chapel at Livadia. Today it is open to the public, and one of the few remnants left of Tsarist glory. Still, it is a far cry from the day when Alex arrived here from Germany to be with Nicholas. Her reluctant conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, a prerequisite to becoming Tsarina, was finally arranged. During this tumultuous period, it was Nicholas's one consolation.
In our deep sadness, the Lord gives us quiet, luminous joy. At 10, my Alex was consecrated.
And so, within 24 hours, Nicholas became Tsar Nicholas II, and Alex became officially his intended. A few weeks later, with relatively little ceremony, they were married. The young bride wrote to her sister,
Our wedding seemed to me a mere continuation of the funeral liturgy for the dead Tsar, with this one difference. Now, I wore a white dress instead of a black one.
Nicholas and Alexandra chose the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, Tsar's village, outside St. Petersburg as their new home. Within 3 months, Alex was pregnant. In the fall of 1895, she gave birth to a girl, Olga. If a daughter was a disappointment for the Tsar and Tsarina, they never expressed it. There was plenty of time for a son and heir. Their immediate preoccupation was the coronation ceremony, over a year in the planning and set for May 1896 in Moscow. It was recorded in a special album, now a rare collector's item. The procession of the entire Romanov family, all their relatives, the kings and queens of other European nations, wound its way through the great halls of the Kremlin. As Nicholas and Alexandra descended the red staircase, they were captured on film, the first ever shot of a state occasion 100 years ago. The religious ceremony in the 500-year-old cathedral lasted a full 5 hours. When it was all over, Alexandra would write to her sister,
I was not at all tired by the ceremony, more elated by my mystic marriage to Russia. I am now truly Tsarina.
At last, wearing the 9-pound imperial crown made for Catherine the Great, Nicholas emerged into the courtyard. Every bell in Moscow's hundreds of churches rang out for the latest and last of the Romanov Czars. The festivities lasted a whole week. 4 days after the coronation itself, the Tsar's munificence as Little Father was to be demonstrated to all with gifts of enameled mugs, food, and drink. On the 18th of May, 500,000 Russians from all over the land gathered at the chosen spot. Then something went wrong, which was to haunt Nicholas forever.
The crowd that spent the night on Khodinka fields waiting for the food and mugs began to press on the structures, and there was a terrible crush. I have to record, with great sadness, that about 1,300 people were trampled.
All Moscow was there. Later, I spoke to someone who'd been carried out from there. He was a boy of about 10 years old. He was dragged in and had to climb out, stepping on people's heads, and came out alive. But on the whole, many people perished there.
My father was there. He was quite young. He was not in his 20s at that time. And he thought that it was so dreadful that he never could have seen something worse. The screaming, the mismanagement. He was terribly upset.
In our family, we kept a little mug, and it was crushed. And when I was a child, I didn't understand why we held on to such a piece of useless junk. But later I realized that it was kept as a relic, that this mug had shared the fate of those thousands of people who were crushed to death there, or crippled for a lifetime.
The catastrophe, commemorated in a Moscow cemetery, was in no way Nicholas's fault. But he, as the new Tsar, carried the blame for the terrible events of the 18th of May, 1896. And in the eyes of many Russians, his wife Alexandra was faring little better. Over the next 5 years, Alexandra would bear 3 more children. After Olga came Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. But still no boy, and so no heir to the Romanov throne. As the new century began, St. Petersburg still appeared peaceful. But radicals like Alexander Kerensky, now a student in the capital, were circling ever closer.
It was Easter, and I was returning late at night, or rather in the morning, about 4 a.m. from the traditional midnight celebrations. I was walking home past the Winter Palace. Suddenly, I stopped involuntarily. On an overhanging balcony stood the young emperor, quite alone, deep in thought. A keen presentiment struck me. We should meet sometime. Somehow our paths would cross.
Years later, it was Kerensky who had the Romanovs arrested and sent the family into exile. But he paled in comparison to that other revolutionary from his hometown. By the turn of the century, Lenin had been sent by the Tsarist government into exile, where he continued to publish his magazine, Iskra, the Spark. His fury at the Romanov rule was already in full force.
Lenin revealed his attitude to the Tsar's family quite early on. In 1903, the abolition of capital punishment was discussed at the Second Congress. And there was a voice from the audience. "You mean that this relates to the Tsar too? We won't shoot him?" Lenin was also present there, and together they passed a decision that it couldn't be like this. The Tsar must be shot. So from the very beginning, the Bolsheviks had this idea that the Tsar must be shot.
But the final days of the Romanov family were still years away. While Lenin railed against Nicholas and all that he represented, the Tsar was unimpressed with Lenin or his newly formed Bolshevik party. In January of 1903, the Russian aristocracy held yet another opulent ball in the Hermitage Theater of the Winter Palace. It was the kind of excess which infuriated the radicals. But Nicky's sisters, Olga and Xenia, found the occasion unforgettable.
All of us appeared in 17th century court dress. Nicky wore the costume of Alexei, the second Romanov Tsar, all raspberry, gold and silver. Alex was just stunning. She wore a seraphim of gold brocade, and her earrings were so heavy that she could not bend her head.
Xenia's husband Sandro, the Grand Duke Alexander, was less gracious.
For at least one night, Nicky wanted to be back in the glorious past of our family, but he was obviously not sufficiently tall to do justice to his magnificent garb.
Also at the ball was a maid of honor to the Empress, Olga Zinoviev, as her son Kirill remembers.
She always felt herself rather awkward in her presence, because she always said that the Empress seemed to feel awkward in the presence of her own maids of honor, or her ladies-in-waiting, or whatever it is. She did not feel quite at home with people, and felt rather shy, and used to be covered with sort of red blushes all the time.
A recluse by nature, Alexandra became increasingly alienated from Russian society and obsessed with her family. At last, at Peterhof Palace, outside St. Petersburg, the Empress gave the Tsar what he most wanted. It was 4 years into the new century, and almost 10 since Nicholas and Alexandra were married.
30th of July. For us, an unforgettable day on which God's goodness was so clearly visited upon us. At 1:15 this afternoon, Alex gave birth to a son, whom in prayer we named Alexei.
Soon, though, Nicholas's elation turned to ashes.
8th of September. Alex and I have been much worried. A hemorrhage began this morning without the slightest cause from the navel of our small Alexei.
It was hemophilia, inherited from the baby's great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, and carried by Alexandra. In those days, sufferers seldom reached adulthood. On top of the family tragedy came political unrest. On what became known as Bloody Sunday, the 9th of January, 1905, a march of loyal but disgruntled workers set out for the Winter Palace to hand a petition to the Tsar. Such a demonstration was unprecedented in the Russia of the Romanovs.
My mother was curious, and she and my father went there, but not with a demonstration. They were in the gardens nearby, and boys there were climbing trees to get a better view, to watch the demonstration.
Despite the peaceful intentions of the marchers, the authorities panicked. To back up the Cossacks with their whips, they called out the infantry with their rifles.
They raised their rifles a little, so as not to fire into the crowd, but over their heads. At this point, boys came tumbling out of the trees, and one boy in particular dropped like a bird, as my mother put it, not far from the spot where she was standing, already wounded, as he fell from the tree. Obviously, he died instantly.
The second volley was aimed directly at the marchers. Several hundred were killed. The radical press grabbed the opportunity to blacken the Tsar's name.
On the 9th of January, or anyway, the very next day after Bloody Sunday, we in Odessa read in the newspapers that the Tsar was holding a ball in the Winter Palace.
This was a rumor, and a false one. The Tsar was secluded in the Alexander Palace, where he had been advised to stay at a safe distance during the strikes and demonstrations which were rocking St. Petersburg.
9th of January. A distressing day. The troops have been forced to fire in several parts of the city, and there are many killed and wounded. Lord, how painful and sad this is.
But the damage was done.
The whole of Odessa already knew what had happened on Palace Square and called the Tsar Bloody Nikolashka. And I too began to hate the Tsar.
Nicholas was not the only Romanov in the sights of the revolutionaries. 3 weeks after Bloody Sunday, his uncle Sergei, the Governor-General of Moscow, was blown to bits at the gates of the Kremlin. Sergei and Ella had spent much time with the Romanovs. In fact, it was at their wedding that Nicky and Alex had met. After the explosion, Ella crawled amongst the remains of her husband, muttering,
Sergei so disliked the mess. Sergei so disliked the sight of blood.
In her grief, Ella retreated from the world, building a convent and becoming its abbess. She would remain cloistered until 1918, when she was arrested by revolutionaries and thrown alive down a mine shaft in Siberia, where she sang hymns for many hours until she died. In 1904, Nicholas had been drawn into a disastrous war with Japan. He dispatched his troops with his blessing, not that they knew where they were going or why.
Japan, for us, was so far away that we had no notion of the existence of Japan, of such a land, of such an island, of such a nation.
The Russian people believed the propaganda, which promised a short, sharp, victorious war. But the Japanese people believed their propaganda, which promised the same and proved to be right. It took the Russian Navy's Baltic Fleet 6 months on the high seas to make the engagement, only to be sunk in a single day at the Battle of Tsushima. The Tsar's reputation, too, was sinking. The Tsar's enemies spread rumors reporting his cool response when told the news of the Tsushima disaster.
Anyone for another set?
But the family remember it differently, as Nicholas's sister Olga noted.
I was at the palace when the telegram arrived. Both Alex and I were with Nicky. He turned ashen pale. Alex broke down and sobbed. The whole palace was plunged into mourning that day.
In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the summer of 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt hosted peace talks between Russia and Japan. The warring nations were financially exhausted by the conflict and desperate to find peace. In the end, the U.S. brokered a face-saving deal, with each giving the other territory. But the little Japanese monkeys, as Nicholas called them in his diary, had shamed the mighty Russian bear. The Tsar's standing was diminished even more. Peace abroad had come, at a price. Peace at home would prove even more costly. In St. Petersburg, factories were closing every day. By October, there was a general strike. The attempted revolution of 1905 was underway, though it would not succeed. The authorities called on the troops, which only strengthened the strikers' determination and the radicals' demands. The Tsar's empire balanced on a knife edge.
The emperor was really faced with an alternative, either to try and smash the opposition by the use of massive military force, or to make concessions to try and win back the moderates. He decided to try and win back the moderates because he felt that even if he did smash the opposition now, by using the army, it would be no permanent solution.
A turning point came when the Tsar's own uncle, the army boss Grand Duke Nikolai, came out in support of a change from the Tsarist system to a constitutional monarchy. The idea of this constitutional manifesto came from the Tsar's chief minister, Sergei Witte, who recalled the Grand Duke's challenge.
Grand Duke Nikolai took a revolver from his pocket and said, "You see this revolver? I will now go to the Tsar and entreat him to sign the manifesto and Count Witte's proposal. Either he signs, or in his presence I will blow my head off."
Nicholas believed that granting a constitution was an abomination and would destroy the Russian Empire. But he had no alternative. Nicholas bowed to fate. It was here in the grand ballroom at Peterhof Palace that Nicholas signed away his sacred inheritance. He would still be Tsar, but no longer the absolute autocrat.
17th of October. Invoking God's help, I signed. My only consolation is that such is the will of God, and that this grave decision will lead my dear Russia out of the intolerable chaos she has been in for nearly a year.
Reluctantly creating the first ever elected Russian parliament, or Duma, Nicholas believed he had bought time. But the taste of freedom promised by the Constitution only intensified the appetite of the radicals. At the beginning of 1906, Nicholas wrote to his mother.
My own dear Mamma, how shameful it is to live through such a crisis in the eyes of the whole world. But this is God's will, and I must endure all troubles until the very end.
Russia's hopes for stability lay in the constitution which Nicky so detested, and the parliament it created. In April 1906, the Tsar and Tsarina came to the Winter Palace for the ceremonial opening of the First Duma. The procession wound its way up the formal Rastrelli staircase and entered the hall of St. George, where the humbled Nicholas forced himself to speak.
May my fervent hopes be fulfilled, to see my people happy and to bequeath to my son a stronger, better, and more enlightened state.
Until now, there had been no legal political parties in Russia. The Duma, with its elected representatives from a spectrum of new parties, marked an irreversible step in Russian political life. Governor of St. Petersburg at the time was Alexander Zinoviev.
To my grandfather, of course, it did represent, if not a revolution, but at least a very radical change. The change from an autocracy to a constitutional or more or less constitutional regime. There was no way back into absolute autocracy. It was Russia's tomorrow, in a way.
The alliance between Nicholas and the Duma was uneasy at best. Whenever he felt the demands of the deputies went too far, he dissolved the Duma, only to reconvene a new, more obedient one. Hiding behind the smokescreen of the Duma and the Constitution, Nicholas and his ministers now set about stamping out radical political opposition. His new prime minister, Peter Stolypin, hanged hundreds of terrorists within weeks of his appointment. But Stolypin's necktie, as the noose became known, still claimed fewer victims than the revolutionaries' bombs. Stolypin's own house was targeted in 1906, but he escaped serious injury. 5 years later, accompanying Nicholas and his family on an official visit to Kiev, Stolypin was caught on camera on the day of his death. That night at the opera, Stolypin was fatally shot before the eyes of the Tsar and his family.
Stolypin slowly turned his face towards me and with his left hand made the sign of the cross in the air. His right hand and uniform were blood-stained. Olga and Tatiana saw what happened. Tatiana was very upset and wept bitterly.
In the midst of Russia's chaos, the Grand Duchesses were growing up, though they took second place to the younger Alexei, who was the heir apparent. He always followed close behind his father, while his 4 older sisters brought up the rear, The Grand Duchesses could not, by law, inherit the throne. In the family, they were known collectively by the initial letters of their names: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Otma. Olga was by temperament closest to her father, honest and well-intentioned. But it was Tatiana who could wind Nicky round her little finger. Her sisters called her the governess. Maria was the most traditional, flirtatious, affectionate, and fond of children. Anastasia was impish and charming, always playing the fool. And young Alexei was the family's darling, and so it had to be admitted, just a little spoiled. Every summer, affairs of state permitting, Nicholas retreated with his beloved family to the Crimea. In the fall of 1911, the newly rebuilt palace at Livadia played host to a special ball in honor of Grand Duchess Olga's 16th birthday. Olga, in her first ball gown, wore her parents' birthday gifts: a necklace of 32 diamonds and pearls, and a matching diamond ring. All the grand families of Russia with sumptuous villas in the Crimea were invited. The nightmares and tears were swept away for the time being. The new miracle of movies caught the Russian popular imagination. The continuation of the Romanov line was there for all its subjects to see. It was a polished piece of publicity. In August 1912, the imperial regime seemed to have recovered its former glory as Russia rejoiced in the centennial celebrations of the victory over Napoleon. It was a time of peace and prosperity. Industrial production was rising, harvests were bountiful, and modernization and new technology were reaching out to all corners of the empire. But there was no scientific breakthrough in the one area that mattered most to the Tsar and Tsarina: medicine. Alexei's hemophilia shadowed their every thought and action. And that summer of 1912 was to be the last time Alexei was still a normal, playful little boy. Soon, the debilitating nature of the heir's illness could no longer be kept secret. The dynasty had a fatal flaw. For Nicholas and Alexandra, it seemed ever more apparent that Alexei's survival and the very salvation of Romanov rule lay in the hands of one man, Rasputin. The cure was to prove as deadly as the disease.